An article from Management Today. Who's it by? It's by Lee Timmins, Senior Vice President of a company, Atos Consulting. But anyway, Lee says he's going to give us 10 top tips as to why ditching email is the way to go. And I thought, this sounds like it's right up my street, because I'm always griping about the use of and misuse of email. Just to give you a statistic, Nicola, he said here that of the 10 top reasons for getting rid of email, the first one he puts down is the use of time. He reckons that the average employee today receives 50 emails a day, and simply reading these messages, doing nothing with them, but just reading them, can swallow 28% of your time. And then another study he's found claims that workers can spend 32 days a year managing these messages, which he doesn't think is justifiable. Does that surprise you?
Not at all. And do you know, it's a subject near and dear to my heart, because having a portfolio career means I have about 4 or 5 different email addresses.
Oh, God, yeah, of course.
So, of course, this issue of clutter in your inbox is multiplied for me.
Yeah.
And I have a particular pet, gripe, really, Mike, is that people that send emails with unnecessary attachments, so you can't actually read the content actually in the email, so you don't know what it's about. You have to waste even more time to open the Word document or whatever it is, and and then decide, well, actually, I'm not interested in this. So again, that's extra time wasted, really.
Double or quadruple clicking.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that's a hangover, somebody who's a hungover from the older days when they had to work. You write a document and then you send it, and you send it via email. But I know what you mean. I think for me, the biggest problem I have with the misuse of email is thinking that it's an efficient way to book my time. Well, 2 or 3 people trying to coordinate diaries over email can take days.
Oh, absolutely.
One phone call, we could have it cracked in 5 minutes.
I tell you where it does help, though, Mike, is when you're working across time zones. So I've worked in the past with people, say, in Singapore, where, you don't really want to kind of pick up the phone at 11 o'clock at night. So you can easily send them an email and then just check your inbox in the morning. So I think, we can't sort of dismiss email completely, I think. I think we've got to give it a fair hearing. I
mean, absolutely. I use it a lot. But there are some things that bug me. This is number 1, the time. Okay. Number 2 for him is bad management. Now, this is something that I think we read a bit of press about. He reckons that it encourages bad management. He doesn't just mean some of the awful examples of sacking people on email and so on, but he does go on to say it's easy for a poor manager to avoid a face-to-face conflict by simply sending an email, which is really not on. What he means by bad management being encouraged is, he said, that perfunctory exchanges take place instead of personal interaction. I think what he means is something that happened in a company. I used to work for a pharmaceutical company. We were getting, as a board of management, we were getting lots more than 50 a day each, and we had a meeting to say that a lot of them were just somebody using 3 words. Yes, that'll do, or something like that. Thanks, great idea. And when it comes in the inbox, to me, you don't know what it's about, and it takes us it loads as much stress as any other email that's in your inbox, and your inbox is never going to empty, and it gets filled up with stuff that is just 3 words long. We actually had a meeting and said, this has got to stop. We want you to walk down the corridor and say thanks. That's a great idea.
Do you know what? I once had a boss who absolutely banned emails in the office on Fridays. So it was Friday free. Yeah. Friday free days. No email was allowed between staff in the office on a Friday. He encouraged everybody to pick up the phone, talk to each other. And, of course, if there was, important customer emails coming in, people had to, needed to respond. But within the office environment, Friday free email day is, I think, a great idea.
Like Dress Down Day.
Absolutely.
Dress Down Friday. Yeah. He's not alone. I read that some big technology companies as well, but unbelievably, Google, I think, was one of them, and maybe even Microsoft. Some of the high-tech companies have had the email-free Fridays to try and encourage staff to just talk to each other. I did have a secretary who emailed me a couple of things, and she sat outside my office. I just went and said, "Hey, please, this is a nonsense." before I get wound up too much about that, let's go back to this theme of Help Me. And there's a track here by the Beach Boys, Help Me Rhonda, which I just love, that reminds me very much of my youth. So Help Me Rhonda by the Beach Boys. Perfect sound. I'm going to carry on, though, with this pet hate of mine about the misuse of email, only because I think we should... I won't cover all 10 points, because I think the last two points are there to make up the list of 10 instead of 8. But pick out some key ones like distraction. He reckons they interfere with the normal workflow, and they take seconds to read, but they add to a sense of overload when you've got a full inbox.
Do you know, I agree with that, Mike, because, you know, oftentimes with emails you get links to the websites, don't you? And then you find yourself off on a little Google trip, don't you? I mean, how many hours can we waste searching on the internet? And I think it's one of those things you really do have to be very, very strict with yourself in terms of, you know, not getting distracted by internet or indeed email. This
is it. A lot of companies have got restrictions on their external access to the internet, haven't they? Because people do, as you say, they wander off and they go on what you've just called a little Google trip. I like the phrase. He mentioned the fact that obviously it's very stressful to see a full inbox, and you'll never ever empty an inbox, particularly an email inbox.
I had a colleague once who did.
Really?
He managed to empty his email inbox, and he would just be obsessed with having those little numbers on his BlackBerry, you know, that tells you how many mails you've got currently or unopened mails in your inbox. And he would look at my BlackBerry and say, "But Nicola, you've got 357 unopened emails. How can you live with yourself?"
Well, again, takes me back to a particular drug company, and as a group we decided, you know, we needed to be more risk-taking. And we, as a group of managers, it was such a safe industry. We need a little bit more risk-taking. And somebody said to me, I'm playing a really risky game these days. I'm deleting emails without even opening them to see how important they were. If they've been at the bottom of my inbox for a week and nobody's mentioned it, click and it's gone. Wow, that's risky. He goes on, this gentleman at Atos Consulting. Yes, here's another pet bugbear of mine, which I think I'll mention, is he said it actually doesn't encourage very good communication skills. He's referring to poorly worded messages, and brief conversations will allow for nuances of speech. Yeah, so it's not what I'm saying, it's how I'm saying it.
Yeah.
So it's not the words, it's how I'm saying it. But he also said that poorly worded messages take to mentally decipher, they take quite a bit of time, which he's calculated could be as much as $16,000 per employee. Just the time to mentally decipher someone's bad grammar, which leads me on to another piece of work that I found. This is is it a blog? It's probably a blog by a gentleman or somebody called, I think that's Kylie or Kyle Vians. Anyhow, this gentleman said, I won't hire people who use poor grammar, and here's why. What do you think? Is this sounding like it's going to be an interesting article?
I think it is an interesting article, this one, yes.
Right, okay.
Yes, so tell us more.
I'll tell you. The opening statement is, if you think an apostrophe was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, you'll never work for me. If you think a semicolon is a regular colon with an identity crisis, I'm not going to hire you. And if you scatter commas into a sentence with all the discrimination of a shotgun, you might make it to the foyer before we politely escort you from the building. And remember the lady who wrote the book about Eat, Shoots and Leaves?
I remember the book.
Right.
Don't remember the lady.
Let's see if I can find her name. I know she's in here somewhere. Anyway, he talks a lot about her obsession, and he said his obsession is not quite as great as hers. He doesn't believe that people who use bad grammar should be shot and buried in an unmarked grave. He thinks that they simply deserve to be passed over for a job, even if they're otherwise qualified for it.
Quite controversial, I think, that one, Mike, isn't it, really? Quite controversial.
Well, this guy runs two companies, portfolio career maybe. He runs 2 companies which do mandatory grammar tests because there are businesses that are involved in writing manuals.
Well, I think, there goes it. I mean, you can't be writing a manual with bad grammar, but I do think you have to take a more holistic, rounded view of somebody. It's a little bit like sort of credit assessing, isn't it? Do you loan somebody some money based upon their credit bureau rating? And if the computer says no, you don't. But actually, there's oftentimes a story behind that. So,
Well, he does say, okay, so I work in a business which might rely upon on the writing skills, but he does say that grammar is relevant for all companies. Good grammar is credibility. This is the point that I probably agree with him. If good grammar is credibility, especially on the internet, he says, blog posts, Facebook, emails and so on, and company websites in particular, the words are all you have and they need to be chosen carefully. He goes on to make the point that if you're not paying attention to the detail, making sure you use the word to with 1 O rather than 2, what other detail are you not going to pay attention to? And he does refer to some research which shows that people who were using bad grammar were not people who paid attention to detail.
However, though, Mike, I have a son who's dyslexic, and I think there are some people who genuinely are detailed people, but they just have some kind of, processing issue going on in their head, which just makes it very, very difficult for them to be accurate in writing, which is where I think computers help. People writing on computers rather than writing with pen, where you've got spell checkers and computers often pick up the grammatical mistakes.
Yes.
I think particularly for something like my son has been very helpful.
Does your son find it a spell checker and so on?
Absolutely, because whilst he's in mid-flow in his head, sometimes getting what he knows in his head written down on paper, his spelling goes out through the door, because he, in order to spell correctly, he has to really focus on that, whereas he rather focus on what he's saying or writing indeed, and a computer makes it easier. But certainly I think I agree with the attention to detail. I think comes back in checking what you've actually written before coming back to email, before you hit a send button. Certainly I always make sure I completely check what I've written before I send it.
I know that. I think the modern technology. So you've got social media, you've got email, and so on, which encourage a lot of communication, a lot of swift communication, and maybe because of that, they encourage you to don't dot the I, and don't cross the T, and don't worry about whether it's a to or a two.
And what do you think about texting, though, Mike? Because there's a whole new text language, isn't it, which a lot of the youngsters are into these days, because you've got to keep it within the 160 characters or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that texting speak is now being, taken across into actual writing.
That would be my only problem with it. Yeah. I mean, I've used, like I think most people do these days, they use text. I'll tell you what I do have against text is the idea that if it's really urgent, you can send me a text. I don't think so, because there's no guarantee a text is going to get through. And if I don't hear the little ping on my phone and it's really urgent, you need to know that I've got the message. So I have had some messages that have turned out to have been really urgent, and eventually the person has rung me in a panic. I said, well, don't text me if it's urgent. Problem, I think, also can be if you allow your text language to drift over into communication externally with customers. I dread the thought of writing to a customer in text speak.
I would never do that. Never do that. No. I think that's unprofessional.
This guy, and I agree with him, says it does matter. It still matters.